do a real quick video today. I got a lot going on, but I did finish the book I was reading, and I want to do a quick, overview of it. And that is My Bondage and My Freedom by Frederick Douglass. I had never had to read, much like all the other books that I've been reading. These are books that I've never had to read in school. So I was not familiar really with them. Obviously I know who Frederick Douglass is, but didn't really, never really learned about him, never had to read his work. And I have to say it was really, really, really interesting. I wish it was a little bit more detailed. He does go into why he can't go into detail on some of the things, and that's because at the time he was a fugitive slave, and he couldn't talk about why or how he got out of the South. He used the Underground Railroad, but he did not give any detail whatsoever. That was really all he said. And he actually doesn't talk very, very highly of it. He mentions it a couple of times, the Underground Railroad, and how it's actually not... because it was advertised so much, everybody knew about it. All the slaveholders knew about it, and so they knew the slaveholders and the people who went to catch fugitive slaves. They knew where the Underground Railroad stops were better than the slaves who were fleeing knew them. So it actually wasn't as great, according to him, as some other ways of getting out of the South. So I found that pretty interesting. And I actually, the most interesting things that I got out of this was really how he talked about the South versus the North and the differences between how he was treated and how just the differences in general between how people acted, how businesses were run, just in general, how different the two places were. And it really, so he talked about, in the South, because everything was based on a lot of stuff, most things were based on slave labor, there was really no impetus, there was no reason for people to work very hard, aside from they worked just hard enough to not be punished, essentially. Whereas in the North, everything was very streamlined. Because everyone was getting paid for what they were doing, things were really, there was they were much more streamlined in the North, and things worked much more quickly, they didn't need as much labor for tasks because everyone worked really hard. And so that, was really interesting. And just how when he ended up basically settling in New Bedford, Massachusetts, and he talked about how the person that he was living with, who basically kind of sponsored him, I guess, in a way, when he moved there, the person he was living with, who was also a black guy, and with his family, and he said that this guy lived in a nicer house, ate better food than even the richest slave owners in the South. And I found that really interesting, because you hear there's this narrative of everything being, built upon the backs of slaves, whereas the picture, at least that Frederick Douglass paints, is more of things were a lot better in the North for everyone, and a lot richer in the North for everyone, because there wasn't slavery, because everyone was getting paid, because there was this incentive to work that there wasn't in the South. So that I found really, really interesting. And that's why I love going back to the original works of people that lived in the time, that experienced this at the time and wrote about it at the time. And instead of reading accounts or reading people that researched it, you know, people that are writing now about the past, reading history from the people that lived that history, I found really interesting. And that was not to say that he didn't, you know, he definitely talked about being, you know, ill-treated in the North because of the color of his skin, for sure. Like, he talked actually at length about that. And like, I think there was like almost a whole chapter devoted to it. And so that, hey, Caesar. So that was really, you know, that was really interesting. But there was always, it almost seemed like he got sort of a, or the impression I got reading it was that there was always like a time where like he would go get on a train and no one would want to sit next to him. And then all of a sudden he would see someone that he knew who was famous, like a politician or something, and that person would come and sit with him and talk with him. And then all of a sudden everybody on the train wanted to know who he was and wanted to talk to him. And it almost seemed like he got this sort of, you know, this pleasure out of, you know, yeah, you didn't want to talk to me until someone who was famous wanted to talk to me. And so, and just proving people wrong about who he was. Like, he seemed to get this pleasure out of proving people wrong about who he was and how well he was educated. And that was interesting. And then also he spent a couple of years over in the UK. And that was also interesting, reading about the differences between the UK and the US and how he was treated. And how over there was no, there was really no bias against him based on the color of his skin. When he was in the UK, he talks about that he didn't face the same prejudice that he did here. And that people in the UK just didn't understand why people in the US felt the way they felt about, you know, people with darker skin than them. And so that was really interesting as well. You know, and he goes and he talks a lot about, it seems like he always kind of like, he doesn't dwell on the really bad parts. And in fact, a lot of the time he says, yeah, some really bad things happen, but I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about this stuff instead. And not that he glosses over those bad things, because at the end there's a whole bunch of there's several appendices with his, a lot of his speeches, and he doesn't gloss over it at all in those. But in the book, it seems like he wants to really talk more about how he overcame everything as opposed to what those things actually were. He just didn't seem to want to dwell on the abuses and everything else that he endured, but that this is how, like, he wanted more to talk about, this is how he got away from it and how he excelled in spite of it. And that, you know, it is a very inspiring book. So I really enjoyed it. Again, like, another one of these, go to the source material for these things, because it paints a completely different picture than what you're given from people that are writers from now writing about history. Reading the actual people that lived through that history is completely different, and it paints a completely different picture. So I highly recommend it. Excellent book, and not much more to say about it. It was really, it was good, and really, you know, gave me anyway a lot to think about, and a lot of just, there was a lot in it that I didn't really realize, and how he talks about. And it was interesting that the difference between this book and Uncle Tom's Cabin that I read just before this, and how things are portrayed and how religion is portrayed. Now, Harriet Beecher Stowe was the daughter of a pastor, I believe. And So she has a completely different take on religion than Frederick Douglass, who wasn't really raised in Christianity per se, and actually, but was religious, did practice in that he was Methodist and practiced, but he found that people in the church were some of the most prejudiced, some of the worst slave owners were those that were high up in the church. And so I found that really interesting, and a very completely different take on Christianity than the one that was given in Uncle Tom's Cabin. So that was really, really interesting too. So that is about all I have to say about it. Check it out, read it, read from the source material. That's, I can't say that enough. And I will be back with another book review. The book I'm reading right now is very heavy and quite a difference from what I've been reading and what I'm going to read after that. So stay tuned for that, and I will see you all later. Have a good one. Bye.